they don't class like the I am statements you find in the book of John as like historically like accurate, right?
Why?
I was reading Richard Bauckham's book.
Hello everyone, welcome to Christianity over Islam, and on today's debate, Sam Shamoun leaves Muslim with no response after brilliant answer in the debate. Let's watch as Sam Shamoun brings this clarity. Sit with your popcorn and a cool chilled bottle water and let's dive into the video.
So I understand a lot of the Muslims here, they're here to troll, but I'm just actually here for like sincere questions.
Good.
I just have this one sincere question. I'm saying this from the bottom of my heart.
Go ahead, man.
So so I understand like a lot of the vast majority of New Testament scholars right now in our day and age, they don't class like the I am statements you find in the book of John as like historically like accurate, right?
Why?
I was reading Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses and stuff, and he came to the conclusion that like the I am statements you find in the Gospel of John, they're just advanced theological developments, and in order to find the historical Jesus, you have to refer back to like the Synoptic Gospels.
Yeah.
Do you know any way to like rebuttal that? Because this is my main issue I have. It's just,
I've already rebutted it. Let me repeat what you were saying so people can understand. He is representing the current state of Christian scholarship. I want you to hear what this young man said. He's not making it up, so you don't condemn him, you don't blame him. He's telling you what you're going to learn in college and seminary by even those who confess to be conservatives, that in John, much of what you have in John are not the words of the historical Jesus. It's more of an interpretation. It's more of John theologizing, telling you what Jesus meant, but not giving you the actual words of Jesus. You guys aware of that? That's what they teach. My challenge to these scholars would be, for the first 1800 years of the church, can you find any conservative Christian, believing Christian, not someone who's an atheist, agnostic, not someone who denies the historicity of the Bible, but someone who affirms its historicity, and that the authors of the books whose names are attached to these books, which we find in tradition, ascribing these books to these authors, believe that these were the authors. For example, there is no competing tradition anywhere in church history that someone other than Matthew wrote the gospel attributed to him, someone other than Mark wrote the gospel attributed to him, someone other than Luke wrote the gospel of Luke and Acts, and so on and so forth. That is a modern criticism. But if you go back as far as you trace the manuscript evidence, even as far back as Irenaeus, the disciple of Polycarp, Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John, no competing voices in the church where they argued about the authorship of these books. Now let's put that aside. You won't find any one of them questioning the historicity of John. Their belief was that John focus on those aspects of Jesus's teaching that Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not mention, and it only makes sense. Why then repeat the very material found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? You already have that material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If that's all John wanted to do, then he didn't need to write anything, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke already say basically the same thing. John comes along and gives us those details not mentioned in the other Gospels, details of the historical Jesus, in order to give us a more complete picture. That was the view of the church. Now, besides that, what evidence do I have that the I am sayings of Jesus are genuine, and the authors knew about these I am sayings, but even though they knew about them, they didn't feel the need to mention all of them? But that they're aware of it? Yes. Mark 6, 45 to 52, Matthew 14, 22 to 33, and John 6, 16 to 21 all repeat the same miracle story of Jesus walking on water. And then when the disciples saw him walking on water at night, they thought they saw a ghost. And in Greek he says, ego eimi, I am, do not be afraid. So right there you have a miracle story of Jesus in which he unveils his identity as the divine I am, as the Lord of the winds and the seas and the waves, who subjugates them by his power. That's found in John, that's already in Mark and Matthew, and yet guess what? Luke doesn't mention it. So if you're going to subscribe to the views of modern scholarship that says that Luke used Mark, that means Luke would have been aware of that I am saying, but didn't include it, which confirms my point. They were aware of the I am sayings, but for their purposes, they didn't feel the need to include many of them, or any of them in the case of Luke, not because they didn't know the I am sayings, but because for their purpose, they didn't include them. That's the answer. So now you need to explain to me, how is it in Mark 6, the first of the Gospels, according to modern scholarship, you have an I am saying of Jesus found in John 6 in the context of Jesus walking upon the waters to demonstrate his sovereign authority over the winds and the waves, something that the Hebrew scriptures ascribe to Yahweh alone.
I wouldn't, you see, I can't object to that. What you said is the truth. I mean, they all, you see, even I don't want to divert or anything, but I know even in Mark 1, it's already quoting Isaiah 40 verse 3. You know?
And which is found in John, right? Where the Baptist says, I am the voice of Isaiah as the prophet Isaiah said, of one crying out in the wilderness. So in John 1:23, John the Baptist says, I am the voice that cries out in the wilderness, as the prophet Isaiah announced. So Mark 1 and John 1 both agree Jesus is the Lord of Isaiah 40, and both agree that John the Baptist is the voice, the forerunner, preparing the people for the appearance of Yahweh, who turns out to be Jesus. So the so-called earliest gospel and the last of the gospels both begin by affirming that Jesus is the God of Israel, the human appearance of Yahweh.
I agree with that. I don't object to that.
So where is the development? If the earliest gospel portrays Jesus as Yahweh in the flesh, because scholars say Mark is the earliest gospel. I'm not saying they're right. Let's assume, let's buy into their assumptions. Mark is the first of the gospels, and then the latest gospel supposedly John, because John is the last of the gospels. So if you have Mark affirming Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh, and you have John affirming that Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh, where's the development in Christology?
Yeah, now I don't see the development at all, because they all portray him as Yahweh in flesh. Now that I look at it, yeah.
So that's why I'm aware of the arguments of scholars, and I don't buy it. I'm not convinced, because it's not true. Matthew, Mark, Luke are unaware of the I am sayings. Why? I just gave you an example. Mark 6:50. The Greek is right there. Ego eimi, I am, do not be afraid. Exact same context is found in John 6, because Mark, Matthew, and John record the same miracle story. So I want to repeat it for everyone else, because I was speaking a little fast. Again, everyone write down Mark 6:45 to 52, Matthew 14:22 to 33, Matthew 14:22 to 33, and write down John 6:16 to 21. It's the same story. It's Jesus walking on water, and it actually appears in the same context, because in Mark 6, Matthew 14, and John 6, it follows up Jesus's miraculous feeding of the 5,000 men, with women and children to be more. So here, Mark, Matthew, and John all record the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness with a few loaves and a few fish, and then all record that right after that, the disciples got on the boat to head to the other side, and in the middle of the night, Jesus walked on water and said, Ego eimi, I am, do not be afraid. So I'm going to ask you the question so you can get the point, which you already got, but just for emphasis.
Sure.
If you believe that's what scholars say, that Luke used Mark as one of his sources, right? Because Matthew and Luke supposedly used Mark, and then they edited Mark and changed Mark according to the view of scholars. Let's go with that. Let's assume they're right. That means Luke would have been aware of this story because it appears in Matthew. So if Matthew and Luke are using Mark, Mark has the story of Jesus walking on water after feeding the 5,000 men in the wilderness with a few loaves and few fish. And then as he walks on the water, he says, I am, do not be afraid. Matthew includes both the miraculous feeding and Jesus walking on water and claiming to be the I am, Ego eimi, I am. Luke had Mark, would have seen that story, but didn't include it. Isn't this proof that the writers, at least let's stick with Luke, Luke was aware of the I am sayings, even though he didn't include them?
He definitely was aware of them, yeah. If he's using Mark as a source and he's using the Gospel Q and like an L source, he's aware of all the I am statements you find.
So that's,
I won't object to that, yeah.
That's my point. Just because John records more I am sayings than found in Matthew and Mark, and in Luke, you don't even find one example of Jesus using Ego eimi that's similar to that of John. That doesn't mean they're not aware of it. It means they had their own reasons for including the material that they wanted to be included, because there's only so much information you can include in a scroll that is so long, and so they have to be selective. And this is where John comes and says, I'm going to now complement these gospels by not repeating what's already there, because it's already there. If you take their assumption, would you subscribe to that assumption and say then that by that same principle, when the Quran quotes Jesus saying something that's not found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that definitely is not historical?
That's a hard one.
Because that's the assumption, right? What's the assumption?
Yeah, I can see the double standards playing. Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, you understand the assumption? The assumption is, since John quotes Jesus saying things and doing things not found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that means the things of John must be either fabrications, stuff he made up and attributed to Jesus, or John is giving you an inspired interpretation of what Jesus meant, but not actual history. So we go with that assumption. I look to the Quran, and there are things that Jesus says in the Quran not found, and even directly contradicts what's found in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and even John. So by their principle, that means the Quran cannot be trusted and should be rejected, right?
Yeah, I can agree with that.
So why do Muslims use scholars selectively and not consistently and just go all the way and become agnostic and atheist like the Apostle?
Shamoun's point about the long-standing belief in traditional authorship of the Gospels is significant. He argues that for centuries, Christians believed that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John authored their respective Gospels. This traditional view asserts that there was a consistency in early Christianity regarding the attribution of these texts, contrasting sharply with contemporary scholarship that questions these authorship claims. This line of reasoning serves to challenge the notion that John's Gospel is merely a theological construct. By pointing out that similar themes and sayings appear in earlier Gospels, Shamoun attempts to unify the narratives of the New Testament, suggesting that the core identity of Jesus as divine is consistent throughout. This approach reflects a common apologetic strategy, where the authority of tradition is invoked against modern critics. However, it also raises questions about the interpretation of historical evidence and how it is influenced by faith perspectives. The debate illustrates the tension between faith-based and critical scholarly approaches to scriptural text. This argument highlights a double standard in the treatment of religious texts. Shamoun effectively pushes the interlocutor to consider the implications of accepting some scholarly critiques while rejecting others. It also underscores the complexities involved in interfaith dialogue, where differing epistemologies often clash. The discourse reflects a broader theological debate regarding the nature of revelation and interpretation within Christianity and Islam. Both parties present their positions passionately, revealing how deeply these texts are intertwined with their faith identities. The exchange invites further inquiry into how believers reconcile historical criticism with their spiritual convictions, a topic that remains relevant in contemporary theological discussions. Thanks for watching this video, and hope you learned from this debate. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so that each time we drop our new video you will be notified. See you in our next debate and don't miss out.